It is Saturday, May the 2nd, 2015, and I am honored to have Jon Proctor as my guest today. For those of you who know Jon, you'll know that he's had a fascinating 27-year career with TWA, and he's an acclaimed author. Jon has written 3 books. His 2 books on the Convair 880-990 and the Boeing 720 are the gold standard for classic airliner histories, and his 3rd book is titled From Props to Jets, and it was co-authored with Mike Machette and Craig Cadera, and that book is a print book that you can buy on Amazon. The 720 book and the Convair 880-990 book are now available as ebooks on Amazon, so you can carry them with you when you travel and enjoy them. And you can also get them on Apple's iBooks system, as well as my own henrytenby.com website. We'll talk about more about that later. And for anybody joining us, again, I just want to reiterate that if you have any questions, you can send them through to us on the chat screen, and Jon and I will both see them. So without further ado, Jon, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you, Henry. It's fun to be here. As you said, this is a new experience for us, but I hope everybody else finds it interesting.
Exactly, and hopefully it'll be fun too. Exactly. So Jon, is there anything that I missed on the introduction? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, not really. As most of you know, after leaving TWA, I fiddled around a little bit with a couple of companies, and then got involved with the Airliners and Airways magazines. And my last job within the industry was editor of Airliners, and it's been 10 years since I've been out of that. And I also have my own website, jonproctor.net, where I've posted pictures and some of my airline career.
It's an absolutely fabulous website, Jon.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah. So, Jon, I understand that your father is was an aviation pioneer, a commercial airline pioneer, and I'm wondering if you can tell us about his background, because I think that's where the story starts.
Well, that's probably where I got a lot of my airline disease, shall we say. My dad was born in 1890. I came from older parents, and in 1927, he went to work for newly formed Colonial Western Airways, which was eventually folded into American Airlines, and he started flying the mail at the end of that year between Buffalo and Cleveland. And he went on to stay with American until his retirement in 1950. And he was the first airline pilot in the United States to reach mandatory age 60 retirement. And that's before it was a law. It was an airline rule. It became a law about 10 years later. But he had quite a career.
Where did your dad learn to fly? Was he with the military during World War I or that era?
Yeah. Yes, he learned to fly in World War I. He said that he became an aviator, as they called it back then, because it was a nice alternative to being in the trenches, and he had no real interest in flying. He just thought there was a safer way. And after the war, he stayed in the newly formed reserves. It was the Army Air Corps then, Army Signal Corps, and he stayed in the reserves and did some other things. And then when this airline job came along, he took that in 1927.
Wow, so I guess he was one of the top 10 or top 5 for seniority with the company during its formative years.
He was, and when they, in 1930, they formed American Airways. It was part of AVCO, but anyways, they kind of drew lots for employee numbers, and his employee number was 2.
Wow, incredible.
Airlines. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
He became the senior number one pilot in the mid-40s when another pilot, Ernie Sloninger, left to go to work for Matson Lines when they formed the airline branch of Matson Lines.
Incredible. So what aircraft did your dad fly through the 40s? Mostly DC-4s?
Well, he started. Yeah, DC-6 was the last thing last type he flew with American. He was on 4s and 3s, and it goes all the way back to when he first started flying the mail. He was flying Pitcairns and Fairchild cabin planes and S-38s. You might be interested. He flew the first. He actually was on board one way and flew back the first international airmail flight between Buffalo and Toronto in a
incredible
S-38 flying boat.
What amazing stuff! Now, so during these years, during the World War II, did your dad did he stay with the airline, or did he go to the war effort?
No, he had stayed in the reserves, so he was called up early 1942, and he stayed in until the war was over. In a variety of jobs. For a while, he was the commander of the Air Transport Command at LaGuardia Airport in Mitchell Field, Milwaukee, and then he flew the Burma Hump during the last year of the war.
In commandos or DC-3s?
No, well, both C-46s and C-47s. He was commander of the India wing of the CBI theater.
Incredible. So basically, yeah, so when the war ended, he had 5 more years of his career before it was time for his retirement. Right.
And he was approached to stay in the military. He was offered a star. But at that point, you're at the best part of your career in the airline business. And he said the retirement pay wasn't that much different, so he stayed with the airline.
Wow. So now, where did you and your family live as your dad was, working through his career?
Well, I was born in Chicago, where Dad was based at that point. He started in Buffalo and then Newark, Cincinnati, and Chicago. He retired. We went out to camp. I can just add, when Dad retired in 1950, they asked him to stay on as the head of pilot training in Chicago, and he did that until 1957. For the pilots, I don't know if we have any pilots in the group, but one of the downsides of being the first to retire is your retirement's usually not very good. And so he was actually making more money from his Air Force retirement than they did from the airline back then. So he stayed on, and we moved to California in 1957.
Okay. Now, what about you? You had other family. Was it your brother who also worked in the industry, or were there other family members as well that were working in the industry?
Yeah, I had 3 brothers. They're all gone now, but my brother Bill was a TWA pilot for 34 years, and he retired in 1990. And my brother Bob was with American for a short time and left. But Bill and I, of course, we worked together. We were with the same company. We developed much closer relationship in the airline end of it. Unfortunately, Dad was gone when I was only 22, so I didn't really. I wish I'd gotten more time with him just to pick his brain on his life. And I do have a page on my website about my father, the entire history of my dad, for people that want to know more about it.
Wow. Well, now Bill, so I'm sorry, he was a pilot as well?
Yes.
Like your father? And
yes,
when did he start flying?
He started in the military around 1954, I believe. He was in ROTC, and then the Air Force, flew F-86s. Didn't see any combat. It wasn't called up to Korea, and then he went to work for TWA in 1956.
Wow.
So
and what
he started
aircraft
on
did he start on?
He started on the Martins. the 202s and 404s, and then went to the Connie, and eventually the 880s, 727, and the 1011.
Okay. Now, what events or people inspired you to get into the industry yourself? Was it your family members, or was it something else?
Well, I imagine it was just when I was a wee child, hearing all these stories from my family, and Dad used to occasionally take me out to Midway Airport, where I could hang around airplanes, and I guess that's where I caught the disease. I wanted to be a pilot, but when I was about 17, my eyesight went from 20/20 to 2200 almost overnight. So Dad pulled me aside and said, "Son, if you can't do this for a living, I suggest you stay out of it," as far as piloting. So I took his advice, but I still got on with the airlines, but I wasn't able to fly commercially.
So how did that happen? So you were in high school, and how did you get your foot in the door? How did it all start for you, John?
Well, in college, I went to San Diego State in 1960, and was there 1 year and left. Honestly, I flunked out of college, and I went to a junior college where I behaved myself and got a degree. But in between there, I got on with PSA in reservations in San Diego. PSA had just pulled all of their reservation offices from San Francisco, LA, Burbank, and San Diego, consolidated them into one office, and they were hiring people. And through a mutual friend, I got on with PSA. And I left when I went back to school. I went up to Cal State Northridge, and I was up there a short time and injured myself, tore up my leg, and had to drop out. And I went back with PSA for a while. Then came back to school, and I started with TWA in 1964. But interestingly, the fellow that got me on with TWA also got me on with PSA. He had been with TWA in the Hughes days, and he ran a sporting goods store down in California, in La Jolla, where we lived. And he kind of greased the skids for me, and I started as a ticket agent in April of '64 at LA.
Wow. Now let me digress a little bit. A big part of our interest in aviation is photography. And back in the day, it was slides, and many of the people that are listening to this were probably slide photographers and collectors of aircraft slides. And I know that you were big into aircraft slide photography. So can you tell us about that? How you got started in that? Who inspired you? And when did it start? Was it when you had the PSA job? I'm sure a lot of people would like to know about all this.
Well, it's kind of funny, Henry. I started off like most kids my age in Chicago with a Browning Hawkeye, and then a little box camera, a tourister camera that took 620 size film, and it was all black and white because color print film even then was very expensive. But in 1960, my brother Bill gave me a 35 millimeter camera, and I immediately started shooting slides. But again, I mean, we're talking for a 36-year-old of Kodachrome was like a week's allowance. I still wasn't working. So I carried around both the black and white and the slide camera for a long time. I mean, well into the mid-60s, and started shooting.
Was it Bill that was shooting slide? And how did he know about the...
Well, Bill did some shooting, and his pictures, his really old pictures from the 40s are on my website. They're all black and white, but I don't think he ever shot 35 millimeter. Why he gave me that, I don't know, but it was like a new and different camera. It was very exciting compared with a very rudimentary black and white one that I had, and you needed light meters and, you know, all sorts of stuff back in those days.
Wow. So, I mean, were there specific aircraft back when you first started that you were really interested in, or was it the jets or the classic props? What was it that you were chasing back then?
Well, when we moved out to California, San Diego was the nearest airport. And when I moved there in 1957, my family moved there. There were only 5 airlines at San Diego: American, United, Western, PSA, and Bonanza. And we're still in the prop era, and I shot the daylights out of those in black and white. And then United came in with 720s, and American was 720s, and PSA had the Electras, and Bonanza had the F-27s, and that's what really kicked me off. But until I got up to LA to do some shooting, I was pretty well confined to those 5 airlines.
Wow. So were you drawn to the Convair 990 because it was a home-based aircraft, or not really?
Oh no, because because they were building it at San Diego. So
okay.
I saw them, the test airplanes taxi out and take off. I actually saw the first flight of one of them and started photographing them. And there was a classmate of mine named Barry Cogan, who I believe is still with us. We've lost touch, but his father was president of Convair. Where I guess he was executive VP, went on to be president of Convair. Right. So I got a lot of feedback from him, and across the street from us lived a retired VP of marketing for United Airlines, a man named Harold Crary. He gave me all of his Aviation Week magazines. And, of course, there was a lot on the developing jets. But I just kind of honed in on the 880s and 990s because I got to see them down there. I mean, San Diego didn't get much jet service until 1960, about a year after jets came in.
So, but back in the period, say, 57 to 1960, when they were testing the airplanes, did you used to see them in the circuit and, flying over the beach out to the ocean to do their testing all the time? Was it a regular thing to see them?
To a degree. We lived in La Jolla, and I should tell you, La Jolla then was just a tired little area and suburb of San Diego. Nothing like it is today. But the airplanes, when they took off mostly to the west, so they didn't really come over La Jolla. So I pretty much saw them when I was at the airport, which was most of the time. Okay.
So what was your first jet ride?
My first jet ride, of all things, was on TWA from Chicago to LA. In 1959, I got to go back home to Chicago for the first time on a visit. And I had worked 2 summers as a busboy in a hotel to get enough money together to buy a ticket. And towards the end of that second summer, my folks helped out. And I had enough for a coach, a coach flight down to Chicago, and I rode out on American. And my brother, and I was coming back on TWA, I should tell you that, on a Super G. I'd never been on a Connie. And my brother Bill ruined it all by sending me $7. I still have the receipt for a 707 jet surcharge ticket so I could ride a jet.
Incredible. Wow. So now, when you were working for PSA in the early 60s, did you have your staff benefits so you could fly around and ride on different aircraft types?
The staff benefits for PSA were all the passes you wanted to go to LA, Burbank, or San Francisco. There were no reciprocal airline agreements. And a pass to LA was $1, and a pass to San Francisco was $3. So you couldn't.
Were you doing
well, oh yeah, God, all the time. Every weekend I'd get on an airplane if I could. But I worked for a travel agency in 60 and 61 during the summer, and the PSA rep there, who I got to know, would hand out passes. So I got to ride on PSA passes earlier.
Wow. So did you also fly in the was it the DC-4s and 6s they had as well? I guess in 3s?
When we moved to San Diego, they had just transitioned over to got rid of the last 3s, and I bought a ticket up to LA in December '59, and I remember the day I wanted to go, all they had was 2 DC-4 flights, and I should have done that, and they said, no, I'll wait a day and go on the Electra, and I never got a DC-4 ride.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Big mistake. Big mistake.
Incredible stuff. So now, back then, did you have a favorite airport for our hobby? Like, was it LA? Was it San Diego? Was it somewhere else? Was it San Francisco? Was there somewhere you really liked to go and hang out at and watch the aircraft?
Once I got mobile enough to travel around, it was usually LA, close enough. And I flew up to San Francisco a few times.
And would you go? Was it the theme building, or was there some other spot that you would go to take slides at LAX?
I took them all over. They're on the LA page of my website, but I shot from all over there, and I did do some shooting from the theme building. I should tell you that I had my 21st birthday drink at the restaurant in the theme building.
Incredible.
Yeah, my brother and his wife took me up there. I had a vodka martini, and it was the last one I ever drank.
Incredible. Do you remember what the highlight of the day was in terms of aircraft, or that's too specific a question?
Well, there was so much then. I mean, now we're talking, I turned 21 in 1963. So by then, I mean, the fan jets were in, turbofans. LA had a plethora of different equipment. And I shot pictures there that day before we went up for dinner and my drink.
Wow. So now, speaking of special events, can you think of any special stories or that you can share with us from your first PSA job?
Well,
is there any
PSA in those days, of course, was very small. While I was there, they got their 6th and final Electra in the original order. So I don't know how many employees they had then, but it wasn't very many. And the reservation office was actually in a little building right next to the hangar, and the hangar also had training rooms, which is where we got our training. But I worked swing shift, and it was a party. I mean, at midnight, some of us would hop in somebody's car and drive down to Tijuana,
amazing,
till dawn, and and come back. It was very much a party airline, and
wow,
a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that time.
Now, on a more serious note, I recall that you're telling a story some time ago about it was a tragic story about a gentleman. I think you were working for TWA, perhaps at LAX, and he was going somewhere, and it involved a fateful flight. I'm wondering if you could share that story with us, John.
Oh, that's probably we lost a Convair 880 at Cincinnati. Crashed on approach, which was the only fatal accident we had with the Convair. And I had just become a commissary supervisor that day. That was my first day as a commissary supervisor, and I went on and checked all the commissary supplies and everything on that airplane before it left. It was delayed quite a bit, and I went over and met another flight coming down from San Francisco, and a man ran off, and he had been going, as I recall, to, I believe it was Louisville. I can't remember for sure, but anyway, he'd missed his connection, so I took him over to our little service counter and suggested he might want to go instead to Cincinnati because that's fairly close to Louisville, and he had a corporate airplane that was going to pick him up, and he did. He switched over to that flight and unfortunately didn't survive.
Terrible. Boy, oh boy. Well, so this job that this was your first position with TWA. How long did that last? And then where was your next job?
Well, I think I had 13 different jobs. I'd have to count them, but I started as a ticket agent in 1964, and that you worked at the counter and the gate area. And in 1966, TWA received a contract to run a tour program at the Kennedy Space Center, NASA tour program. And they took 12 of us from the system to go down there and help start the program up. So I was actually a tour guide drove the bus, did the whole thing down there for a summer. I came back in 66, and then 67 I became a commissary supervisor, and then in 1968 I became an instructor, then a commissary instructor, and in 69 I went to New York to our corporate offices.
Now that was a marketing job, John?
The corporate office, no, that was in in-flight programs, and it basically was working dining in commissary. I did all the galley packing for a while. Figured out what went where in the galleys, and worked on procedures, that sort of thing.
Okay, and so I guess you did a lot of. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I did. There were a lot of different jobs. Some may not know I went to work for Pan Am briefly. I left TWA in 1970 with one of our people who took a few of us with him, and I worked for Pan Am in a similar job until July of '71, and then I went into the Director Customer Service Program, where we're actually an in-flight management representative on the 747s.
Wow. So now were you actually a flight attendant at some point in your career?
Much later.
Much later. Okay.
Yeah, they actually the DCS program was eliminated in 1976. It was really designed when we first got the 747s. There was a bit of confusion, shall we say, in the cabin. I mean, we tripled the capacity, we tripled the staff. You needed someone there to kind of pull everything together, and we sold tickets, we supervised the crew, we visited the dining units, all that sort of thing. Once they got it really working the way it was supposed to, the job was phased out, and we went on the ground as flight attendant supervisors. But I was 70 miles from the airport, which all of a sudden 5 or 6 times a month became 5 or 6 times a week, going back and forth from Connecticut to JFK. So later they offered anyone who wanted to become a flight attendant to start in the spring of '77, and I only did that for about 3 weeks, and then went to Saudi Arabia on a contract with Saudi.
Okay. Now back to the 747 inaugural, I seem to recall seeing pictures or slides that you perhaps had taken at San Francisco of the inaugural TWA 747 service, or were they in New York? Was that something you were there for yourself?
I was in New York. I was in San Francisco for the San Francisco to New York inaugural. It wasn't the first 747 service, but it was the first San Francisco to New York, and it was while I was still working in the corporate office. And it had to do with I was doing all this galley packing, so I was out there for the first flight, and then I flew on it.
Did you do more than the one flight, and what would be your memorable? Is there anything you can share with us memorable from that first? Was that your first 747 ride?
No, I was on the route proving flight in February of 1970, the domestic route proving flight. We flew out from Kansas City to LA, up to San Fran, and then Chicago and New York. And we left Kansas City with a whole plane load of instructors and people like me and a host of FAA people, and we took off, and we couldn't get the wing landing gear to retract. They had they had failed to plug in the hydraulic system on the gear, so we flew with the wing gear down all the way to LA, and it took almost 4 hours because we couldn't exceed I think 250 knots. And
you must have been at it.
Yeah, we went to altitude all right, but we had to be slow. And they decided it was a better idea to do that than we would have had to dump fuel if we went back to Kansas City. So we went on it to LA, gear down.
Wow. So now, when the airplane went into revenue service, what did passengers think? Was it like getting onto a spaceship? Were they, or not so, like, what was the level of people being impressed with the new airplane? Do you remember people being in awe, or what?
Oh yeah, I mean it was exciting. First of all, it was so big, and back then seating was a lot more comfortable, and we were not carrying real heavy loads. 1970, 71. I mean, most of our flights were half full at best, so it was very spacious. Some actress was quoted as saying at L.A. when she saw the airplane, she said, "What time does this place get to New York?" Because it was so big. But they were comfortable, and once we got the service figured out, and able to effectively give a good service. Why it was very nice. You have to remember back then the seating was 9 abreast instead of 10 abreast in coach. The seat pitch was much more generous. I mean, it was a whole different experience.
Yeah, like 35 inches or 37 inches maybe compared to 31 today.
Yeah, interesting. The domestic Convair 880s that TWA and Delta flew had the seats bolted into the floor. They didn't have track seating, and they were 38 inches. 38 inches.
38.
Yeah, now you got to remember the seats were a lot thicker, so maybe equivalent about 35 today, but still.
Right.
There was no way they could, and they couldn't jam any more seats in because they didn't have the ability to move them around.
Wow. Well, now that you mentioned the Convair Jets, let's talk about them for a bit. Now, in the early 70s, late 60s, were you chasing 880s and 990s to fly on them because of your interest?
To a degree, I was. The first ride I got on was on Delta from San Diego to LA. One of the nice things about being an airplane fan living in San Diego at that age was it was even first class up to LA was only like $10. It was a 40-minute flight. So I got a lot of firsts on that route. But that was the first one, and then TWA from Boston to New York in about 1965, I believe. Another thing for people in the airline business, they may not realize back when I started at least, we had to wait a year for passes. You didn't get any passes for the first year. You got 50% reduced rate after 6 months, and then your passes were limited. So, and plus we didn't have that many agreements with other airlines. We had some, but for the most part you had to stick on your airline. So that limited what you could do.
So in hindsight, PSA was perhaps more generous or it was easier to fly around on them than TWA?
As long as you wanted to go to LA or San Francisco, it was from San Diego.
Wow. So now, how would you compare the 880 and the 990 from a passenger perspective? Were they any different, or was it like being on a DC 910 versus a 30?
Well, they were comfortable because of the 5 abreast seating. You couldn't quite squeeze 6 in the back. The 880 especially was very quiet inside, not outside, but inside. Yes, well, part of that was because it had a thicker skin, and that was the way they built the airplane. Rather than having as much ribbing and support that way, they just had a thicker skinned airplane. And I remember once you took off and went to cruise, it was very, very quiet on the inside.
Now, what about the takeoff? Because I can imagine from the outside it would sound like thunder, but because it's 4 F4 engines. Yeah,
it was pretty noisy, just like the first 707s DC-8s. If you were sitting in the back, I mean, it rumbled. It was noisy on takeoff. It really was. But the 880, I remember so much at cruise it was quiet, and the 990 was the same way. So
you didn't prefer one over the other, or did you?
Well, it wasn't a matter of a choice. I mean, at that point when I was traveling around, we didn't have any reciprocal with American at all. So it was on TWA, and I had some passes before I went to work for TWA through my dad, and got a few 990 rides. But once I went to work for the airlines, I didn't get on American again for a long time.
Okay. So from your knowledge with TWA, did passengers prefer the 707 or the Convair 880?
Sad to say, Henry, I don't think they knew the difference.
They did.
No, I mean, a savvy businessman who had to ride coach might have wanted to ride at Convair because of 5 abreast, but they didn't. They didn't really know the difference.
They didn't have a clue.
The 707. If you were in first class, the 707 was quite a bit roomier. It had a lounge, and we took our lounges out on the 880s before I went to work for the airline, and the 4 abreast in the 880 was not as comfortable as it was on the 707 because of the width. But other than that, I don't think people knew one way or the other.
They didn't. Okay. Now, as their service was coming to an end with TWA, did you actively say, "Oh, I want to fly on get as many flights in as I can. In whenever that was in 1973 or 74. Or
I did. I did quite a bit, and I was lucky because by then I was in that DCS job. I was based in Chicago from 72 to middle of 74, and Chicago still had a lot of Convairs going through there. We had a crew base there, and they scheduled a lot through there. The last flight was in May of 74, and unfortunately, I was flying on a 747. I couldn't get the time off to ride on that last one, but I did get a lot of flights in at the end. We were going places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Denver. I got a few.
Wow, so relatively short sectors for an aircraft of that size and stature compared to what.
Well, it was built as a medium range jet. I mean, the longest segments, we had 2 long segments, and they were L.A. Pittsburgh, and westbound. That was a stretch. And then we flew it from Las Vegas to New York for, I believe, 1 summer nonstop. But it really wasn't designed that way. When it was first designed, it was going to be a short to medium range airplane. And then Howard Hughes got involved, and they fooled around with it to the point where it couldn't get into those small airports that they originally envisioned. They couldn't get into LaGuardia, O'Hare, or Washington National, and then it was used more for longer flights. Plus, when we got the airplanes, we needed jets. I mean, we needed whatever we could get to replace pistons. Just like right. American probably would have canceled the 990 order because of all the inherent problems with the design. But at that point, they had to wait too long to get Boeing, so they took them.
They just took them. Wow. So did you ever have any flights on Convair Jetliners outside of the U.S., over in Europe or Asia, Cathay Pacific?
No.
Example?
No. Again, by the time I could, here's another deal with the airlines, at least the TWA, you had to wait 5 years for an international pass.
Wow.
You know, and you had to get over there to ride one of those airplanes. I mean, you know, if you want to go to Asia or you wanted to go to Europe, you had to get there, and I wasn't eligible to get there when most of them were being phased out.
So today, are there any of your former TWA colleagues who are also, you know, coworkers on the 880 that you're still in touch with, be it pilots or other people, flight attendants or
oh yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, a few. It's funny. I saw a picture. It was either Facebook or Flickr not long ago of a well, we call them hostesses then, but a flight attendant wearing one of the paper dresses. We had this paper dress campaign in the late 60s called For an Accent, and one of them was a gold kind of a mini dress. And here's this picture of a gal standing in the door of an 880, which of course got my attention, and her name was Karen Pfeiffer. It's now Karen Bagnall. She and her husband are good friends, live over on the Columbia River. We still keep in touch.
Wow. So when the 880s were retired, there was a company that was going to, I believe it was associated with Howard Hughes, that was going to re-engine them and possibly, you know, remarket them as freighters. Can you tell us about that story?
Well, the re-engineering never happened. I have a friend who is an aeronautical engineer who actually got a little bit involved in the proposal to re-engine them, and it never went beyond the drawing board. It just wasn't economically feasible. They were going to put GE, I think CFM engines on it, but it just never.
Okay.
Yeah, it just never happened. But the cargo conversion was American Jet Industries, AJI. And they bought, I believe, 16 of TWA's 880s, and they did convert 4 or 5 of them, and only 1 or 2 of them actually saw any service. But again, by the time they did that, you have to remember they retired in 74. They sat for 2 years before anything happened. You're to the point now where they're building 727 freighters and that sort of thing, and it just unfortunately never bloomed. And those airplanes were eventually cut up.
So did you ever see Elvis Presley's 880?
I walked through it at Graceland, and I remember seeing it in Phoenix one time when I was down there on watching spring training baseball, and he was doing a concert, and both his 880 and his Jetstar were there. I saw them parked.
Wow.
I never got on it. Never got on it until it was in the at Graceland.
In the museum, yeah. Hound Dog 1 and Hound Dog 2, I think, was their call sign back in the day.
And they were just rescued. They were possibly gonna cut those up because they wanted to put a hotel on the site by Graceland. And apparently, they were gonna then move them, and I understand now the whole thing is canceled and the airplanes are okay.
Good. That is great news. I guess you're aware that Doug Scroggins is the owner of, I believe it's the Psa Convair 990, which is sitting in Mojave. It's been there for, I guess, decades. And from what I understand from Doug, it's potentially restorable to flight status, airworthy condition. If one had the funds. So I mean, one can dream about a crowdfunding project to do that and perhaps return it to ground running condition first. Do you think there's enough interest out there to make such a thing happen, or is that a pipe dream? It's something I'd love to see happen, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
I think we all would, and I don't want to rain on Doug's parade, but I don't think there's enough money in the U.S. Mint to do that. You just imagine what you would have to overcome. One of the biggest things you would have to overcome is you would have to get some kind of a waiver to operate that airplane and have it exempt from the noise rules. 990 couldn't pass stage 3 or even especially stage 3 or stage 4. So, you might get a permit to move it somewhere, but I can't imagine them allowing it to fly around, which is really too bad. That would be, to me, would be the biggest issue. I'm sure the parts are still there. They're lying around, but I can't imagine they could get through the bureaucratic nightmare that would be presented to those poor guys. I'd be the first guy to buy a ride.
Yeah, because I mean, it would even be neat if they could restore it to ground running condition.
Well, that's something else, Yeah, that's possible. I think one of the Concords has been made to the point where they can taxi it around in England or somewhere, but that's feasible.
Yeah, because then that doesn't involve the FAA. As long as it doesn't leave the ground, it's not an FAA issue. So it's just a neat thing to think about. In all your years of research on the Convair Jetliners, just out of curiosity, has General Dynamics ever expressed appreciation or any form of communication to you, gratitude for all your work?
No, but I got a lot of cooperation from them when I wrote the book. There are a couple of engineers that I've kept in touch with. Unfortunately, one of the most knowledgeable I hooked up with after the book was published, and I could have added a lot to the book and put in a few corrections I might add.
Wow, so he was there back in the 50s when they were designing it?
Designing it and in the late 50s when they were doing especially all 90.
Okay, wow. So now Howard Hughes was, he was tied into the Convair 880-990 story in a number of ways. I'm wondering if you can give us a summary of how he comes into the picture on these aircraft.
The book tells a lot about it, but in order to launch the airplane, Convair wanted 40 orders, and Hughes ordered 30 of them, and Delta ordered 10, and it was kind of a joint agreement between the two. But Howard Hughes, when he had control of TWA, as a practice, bought the airplanes through Hughes Tool Company and Hughes Aircraft and leased them to TWA. TWA didn't own the airplanes, so he had a lot of control over that. And again, it goes back more in my book, but he had some other ideas. There were some earlier designs on the 880 and 990 that didn't happen. And when they finally got to this agreement to build what was going to be called the Golden Arrow, the 880, he had his fingers in everything and drove those guys pretty much crazy because he wanted to modify them and change things. The original, let's stick to your knitting, short to medium range airplane. We'll be able to get into these smaller airports. We'll fill the niche. And, that never happened. So the airplane kind of got bastardized, if you will. Plus, Boeing, didn't want the airlines that were flying 707s to go to the Convairs. It wanted them to stay in the Boeing family and develop the 720, which United, which was ready to buy 880s, switched over, and by that time, the orders were so limited. They only built 65 880s, and you can't make any money doing that. Yeah, and 37 990s.
So now, what's the story about Howard Hughes showing up in his own Electra, or somebody showed up one day in San Diego in an Electra and jumped on an 880 and went for a flight? There's some legendary story to that effect.
Yeah, again, it's in my book, but the chief test pilot, whose name's escaping me now, wrote quite a letter about that to a friend of mine at TWA who shared it, and Hughes just, he announced he wanted to ride on the airplane, and so they had it all set up. They had a car waiting at the terminal to pick him up. He said he'd be there at such a time, and he didn't show up, and they didn't know what flight he was on. All of a sudden, the prototype Electra landed, one of the three in the test program, taxied right up next to the 880, and Hughes walked off the Electra, walked on the airplane, and said, "Let's go." And
incredible, yeah.
And he took the airplane up with the chief test pilot. He sat in the right seat. He didn't necessarily want to land on the left, but they shot takeoffs and landings in the pattern at Lindbergh Field for quite a while, probably an hour and a half, something like that, just so he could incredible. But then he came back, they landed, he said, pull up next to the Electra. He got off, jumped on the Electra, and he was gone.
Just so was this before or after he placed the order?
Oh, no. The order was placed in 56. This had to be in sometime in late 59 or even, probably late 59 or early 1960. But people said that he came up looking ragtag. I mean, with a scruffy pair of pants and tennis shoes, no socks. I mean, he was just, but he could have cared less what people thought of his appearance at that point in his life.
Well, so was that the only time he ever made an appearance in San Diego with General Dynamics? As
far as I know, there's a very good book called Howard Hughes and TWA by Robert Rummel, and if you can find it, and Rummel talks about that, and Rummel was basically the vice president of engineering for TWA. He wound up down there most of the time through these all these talks, and Hughes kept changing his mind on what he wanted and drove Rummel almost insane. But I don't think Hughes ever went to San Diego other than that.
Interesting. Wow. Did you ever see Howard Hughes through
I never did.
TWA?
I never did. And I'll tell you, after long after a lot of these people were gone, Bob Sterling wrote the book Howard Hughes, the Airline, about TWA, and here I'm reading the names of all these people that I had worked with and never knew that had a first-hand relationship. One of them was a guy named Bob McKay in sales, who was one of the few people that had a direct line to Hughes. Usually you had to call the office on Romaine Street, and they would, send the calls. McKay could get through on one call. And I saw him. I worked with him in L.A. for years, and I never knew. I would have loved to bought him a beer, pick his brain.
Incredible. Absolutely. Now, John, let's talk about the 720. That's your other book, which is a fabulous book. I love that book. The 720, not as well covered in the media, perhaps, as the Convair Jetliners or, of course, the 707. I guess I'll start by asking, did you have many 720 rides, and whose 720s did you fly on?
I had a fair amount on, let's see, I didn't get on United. Basically, American, Western, and Eastern, I believe, were the only three I actually got on. It's interesting, the reason we chose that book, I was with World Transport Press then, Airlines Magazine, and the 880 had sold well. Terry Waddington wrote a book on the DC-8, and then the DC-9, and what are we going to do next? And I wanted to pick something with a limited production run, because it's easier to tell the story, and by doing that, you can cover the individual histories, at least in a table, and give them an idea. Right. And the 720 was perfect, because it was a limited production run. There was a lot available through Boeing Historical Archives. The Museum of Flight in Seattle was very cooperative in the production of that book. And to me, it was a very interesting book, and it ties into the Convair 880 because that was Boeing's answer to the 880. If Boeing hadn't built the 720, Convair might have been much more successful because they had a number of airlines interested in the airplane until Boeing came in and said, this is why you should buy the 720. And if you look at the 720, there's only a very, very small handful of carriers that ordered the 720 that were not already flying the 707. So it was a natural.
Okay, and what's the difference for those that don't know between a 720 and a 707 138B? Were they
well, believe it or not,
were they similar?
Well, the 138 originally was built for Qantas, which wanted they wanted the range early on. They wanted to be able to fly nonstop from Honolulu to Fiji, for instance, on the way down to Sydney. So they said, we want the 707, but we don't have we want the range. So Boeing developed the 138, and don't forget, it came before the 720. It was actually shorter than the 720 by I don't know 3 feet or 6 feet. I've got them all in the book, which I don't have in front of me.
Okay.
But the 138 was really a one-off. It was only built for one airline, Qantas, period. But the 720 is a better comparison, and it was 8 or 10 feet shorter. The thing is, it was quite a bit lighter. It didn't have initially it didn't have the capacity. The fuel capacity was less, so you could get it into smaller airports, and it was better for the more medium range flights. And when the turbofan engines came around, and they put the turbofan engine on the 720, that really increased its range, because you had the same tankage, but you had a much lower fuel burn. So they actually flew those. They flew to Honolulu on Northwest out of Seattle, for instance, on a regular scheduled basis.
I mean, that's why I kind of said that they were similar tools, right? With the new engines,
oh sure,
there was a lot of crossover in what those two airplanes could do.
Well, they were fortunate. They were fortunate because you could put the turbofan engine on the same wing without major modifications. They talk now about the A380 being re-engined. Well, the wing will not support it the way it is. A lot of modification costs. The 720 could support the wing. The nacelles were different, and they added a little leading edge glove, but it didn't take much to convert the airplanes.
Right. Now, so when you were working with TWA, I guess you had many flights on 707s and 720s. They were like equal number?
No, we only had 4 720Bs short-term leased from Boeing, and they were gone before I started. They were Northwest.
Northwest. Okay.
Yeah, and they were built for Northwest. Northwest wasn't ready to take them, so they leased them to TWA.
I see. So now, can you tell us about you did an around the world charter in a 707 for TWA in the late 70s. That's an interesting story, and I think people would be interested to hear about that directly from you here. Can you give us a summary of what that was about, John?
Well, it was actually 1980, and TWA for a number of years flew these around the world charters, and we flew them for tour companies, tour organizers that set them up. And the one that I was on was the last one that we operated, because that was in 1980, and the 707 was only 3 years from extinction with TWA, and these operators wanted bigger airplanes. So it was one of the last, but basically it was a 707 300B series, and they put 88 first class seats in it. That's all. And we made 16 stops around the world, and the fare was $16,000 a seat, and that was in 1980 money. So you figure that out today, and it's 40 or 50 grand. But the passengers, number one, this included everything except tips and if you bought drinks with your meals on the ground. But the food was included in the air, on the ground. The passengers had 2 bags each, a warm weather and a cold weather bag, and we unloaded the bags based on our destination. Once they stepped through customs, their bags were taken away and delivered directly to their hotel room. They never touched the bags. So when they left the city, they just closed up the bags, left them on the bed, and they went put them back on the airplane. But for me, it was really exciting because we went to 16 destinations I'd never been to, and they were non-TWA cities. We went to Red China, was Red China then, and we went to the Seychelles, and we went to Easter Island, and we went to exciting places. And the only reason I got on it was my background with dining in commissary, my supervisory experience, that sort of thing. I was a line flight attendant then, but TWA was laying off management people. It was tough times. And the general manager in New York, who I had worked for before, said if I let one of my supervisors go, he won't have a job when he gets back. They're going to say you can get along with him for 35 days. This job isn't important. So I got to go as the charter coordinator. I was real
incredible.
Lucky.
Wow. So how did the 707 perform? It was already, as you said, 3 years just away from its retirement. Was it quite reliable? Was it problem free?
No.
It wasn't. Okay.
We kind of got a lemon, I guess. The flight started in Kansas City. I got on New York, as did the crew that took it the rest of the way. And from Kansas City to New York, one of the turbo compressors failed. And TWA, for you aficionados, may know that our 707s had 3 turbo compressors on the numbers 2, 3, and 4 engine. And that's that little lip on top of the nacelle that provides air conditioning and all that. So you could still go with 2. And they didn't want to delay the plane in New York, so they just put a replacement in cargo, and we took off and went to Marrakesh, the first stop, and we're only there one night, and then on to Lomé and Togo, which is the old Ivory Coast, and we had to replace that turbo compressor in the 105-degree heat and humidity there. And we had a maintenance foreman with us. The maintenance foreman and I were kind of the ground crew. And we got it changed there. I didn't touch anything, but I was a gopher. And we no sooner got that fixed than the thrust reverser failed at one point. We had to replace a thrust reverser. And the HF radio antenna kept acting up. And again, we could go without that, but it's nice to have. So that was being troubleshooted all the way around the world. And then we lost it. Then we had an engine malfunction in Bali. And so we had to do a complete engine change. Yes, there were problems, but except for the engine change, there were no delays. In Bali, we chartered an Air Niugata 707 to take the people on to Port Moresby, the next stop, and then the plane caught up with them a couple of days later.
Oh, what a fabulous trip that was, John. I mean, to be there.
Well, it was really. I would have paid them to go on that trip. I mean,
exactly.
And we still keep in touch. The surviving crew, with one exception, all still keep in touch. After all, it's been 35 years.
Yeah, fabulous. So when was your last 707 or 720 flight?
I was on the last 707 flight with TWA, and it was supposed to be from Miami to New York in 1983, and there were several enthusiasts on there. I got the time off, and I wrote it as a passenger. And we got up to New York, and I got off the plane, and I called crew scheduling to okay my next flight because I was going to take a trip in a couple of days. And they said, hey, by the way, they're going to use that 707 tomorrow and operate a flight back to Kansas City where the plane will be decommissioned. So you were not on the last flight. It's going to be another one tomorrow. So we all huddled, and 4 or 5 of us, and the next day we rode it New York, Chicago to Kansas City. Very nostalgic trip.
Wow. What year? That was 83?
1983, October of 83. No, I believe it was 83. I'd have to check my log, but I'm pretty sure.
Okay. We're getting to the end. We've just got a few more questions, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Jon, what was your, or do you have a favorite aircraft type? Through your whole career, is there one in particular, or not really?
Oh boy, yeah. I guess 707 is hard to beat. The 747, of course, was so exciting. I really enjoyed, the TriStar. I had as much time on it as I did on the 707. Most of my, after the DCS program, once I became a flight attendant and a flight service manager, then, my longing for the airplane was not quite as much because it was a difficult airplane to work in the cabin. TWA never replaced the original overhead bins, so it was always a constant carry-on luggage problem. That wasn't good. And of course, we took a 190-seat airplane and made a 270-seat airplane out of it eventually, so that wasn't as much fun. But reliability-wise, it was just truly an amazing airplane. That was first automatic landing I ever witnessed was on the 1011, and we got into places that nobody else could get into, like Seattle when the weather was bad, right. Because it had such a great Category 3A landing system. It truly was an amazing airplane when you think about it.
Yeah, you mentioned the 747. And you think about it today. The 747, it's on the way out. There's no TriStars flying anymore. Same with the DC-10. All these airplanes that back in the 70s and 80s that were so common. They're just memories now. But it was great that you were there. And,
almost all the TWA 747s, almost all of them have been broken up. The Iranian Air Force has still got, I think, 2 of them flying, but everything else, they're not only gone and retired, they're gone. They've all been scrapped.
Actually, that reminds me. Now, you've been to Tehran and to Beirut, and that was back, in the 70s or 80s. Can you? Those are exotic locations. Can you tell us briefly how you got to visit both?
Well, Tehran was on a Pan Am Around the World junket that I took. It was just riding on a pass, and it was the middle of the night, so I spent no time there. But when I was seconded, as the Brits say, to Saudi Arabian Airlines to help train their cabin crews when they got 747s in 1977 and 78. But these were both leased airplanes from Middle East Airlines. And we would go into Beirut once a week for maintenance on the airplanes. So I got in and out of there. The war was raging, not quite at its peak, but it was challenging going in and out of there. And a couple of times we just landed there, took the passengers off, and flew the plane up to Jordan. They didn't want to risk leaving it at the airport because of the fighting that was going on.
So during that era, did you ever spend any nights in Beirut, or not?
Oh yeah. No, we spent nights. We were at the Coral Beach Hotel out on the coast.
Right.
We had to go through 2 or 3 security stops on the way. A couple of times we wound up in armored vehicles going back and forth, and they told us basically not to leave the hotel. It wasn't quite as exciting as it might sound. I did get to do some photography there, very, very limited.
I've seen some of those slides.
Yeah, it basically was banned, but if you knew the right people, they would get you in a car or do something and let you take a few pictures. But I wish I'd gotten more.
So it really was a 707, 720 mecca, if you will, back then? Or were there other aircraft there too? Yeah.
Well, MEA had 3 747s. We leased 2 of them, so they had a third one that was flying around, which I got to see occasionally. And there were other airlines went in there. British Airways was flying VC-10s in there.
Oh, wow.
Pakistani Airlines, Syrian Arab was flying in there. Alia Jordanian. There was other service in there. But I don't think there were any other wide bodies except Saudia.
Isn't that incredible? Yeah, what an exotic place.
It was indeed. I only spent one night in Cairo. We went through Cairo with Saudia. The 747s I was on flew down from London to Riyadh. Then we would go to Jeddah via Cairo and back, but we didn't overnight there. But I got a few pictures there. That usually cost you at least a pack of cigarettes or maybe a carton to get a little side permission, little backsheesh so you take pictures. But again, I didn't get very much photography in there, and I didn't want to lose my camera.
No, but you did photograph was it an Indian Air Force Tu-104?
It was an Iraqi Air Force. Iraqi. It was a Tu-124, as I imagine. I don't think it was a 104. I think it was a 124. Okay. I'd have to look.
But what a rare thing to see.
Oh yeah.
Very rare.
Yeah, and when I was at Jeddah during the Hajj, the pilgrimage, which 7 million people would come through Jeddah on their way to Mecca every year for the pilgrimage, and 2 million of them came by air. And they had every ragtag airplane you can imagine, and their retreads. I got on one Alitalia DC-8 straight pipe former that had been sold off. They had taken the lavs out. The forward lavs were gone, and it was just solid seats, 107 seats. Yeah, it was, and here I am. The Jeddah, you couldn't take pictures. You'd get in big trouble in Jeddah. So I couldn't take my camera out there, and I would have loved to have gotten some pictures.
Wow. So, John, I think we're just about ready to wrap it up. I wanted to ask you about your involvement with the Byrd Aviation Museum. What's happening with them, and tell us about your involvement with them, John.
Well, I'm really fortunate to live where I live, to be involved with the Byrd Aviation Museum. If people want to learn about it, it's birdaviationmuseum.com, all one word. But Forrest Byrd was the man that invented a medical respirator that replaced the iron lung for polio patients in the 50s. He's 94 years old, and he has a collection of airplanes at a museum up here in Sagal, Idaho, which is just below Sandpoint. There's no commercial aviation there, but there's all sorts of interesting airplanes there, and it's also an invention center. You can see all sorts of prototypes of early inventions. There's a private airport on the property. It's a 200-acre ranch. You can actually fly in there, and I volunteer there about once a week in the summer months, and it's just a treat if you're ever up in this area and want to see an aviation museum that's truly unique. That's one of them.
Oh, terrific! Well, that's excellent to hear, John. I'm very happy to hear about that. So before we wind up, is there anything that you want to add, John, that we haven't touched on that you think people might like to know about?
No, I think you pretty well hit it, Henry. Again, I'm happy to chat with you, and hope people have enjoyed what we've had to say.
Well, John, thank you very, very, very much. I think it's been a very interesting and fabulous look back at your very interesting career. Wish I was there. And wow, it's incredible.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for all you do, Henry, with airlinehobby.com and all your books. I'm just thrilled that the Convair and 720 books are on ebook now, because they've been sold out for a number of years, and just to see them back, not in print, but in view where people can get their hands on them is a treat for me. We appreciate it.
Well, yeah, let's just remind everybody, for those of you watching this in the future, these two books, Jon Proctor's Convair 880 and 990 book and the Boeing 720 book, have been re-released as ebooks, so you can download them and carry them with you on your iPad or other digital mobile devices. And you can get them at the Amazon store. Just do a search for Jon Proctor or Convair 880, 990, Boeing 720. You'll find them. You can also buy them at Apple's iBooks, as well as my own personal website. That's henrytenby.com. On my website, we'll also supply you with a PDF files as a bonus. So, and I do believe our prices might be a little bit less costly than Amazon and iBooks. And your other book, John, From Props to Jets, again, that one you say is still sold on Amazon by your original publisher? People can buy copies of that direct?
It is a disclaimer. The original book was hardcover, and it was mostly color. The reprint in softback is black and white, which may not be as desirable to the readers. If you just Google it from props to jet, look around, you may be able to find it on the used market. Some places still have it. And if you can get the hardback, I think that you might enjoy it more. But it is available in black paperback.
So let's just see. I mean, does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Jon? Send them through. And there we go. Let's have a look here.
Oh, Jack's coming on, I think, on audio. Okay, he asked what my favorite airliner of all time was. And oh, my gosh. Tough question. Yeah, you're a little bit muffled, Jack. I kind of hear it. Sounds like you're in a tunnel. There were so many great airplanes. The 707 has to rank up there with the Jets only because it was my first one. And in my logbook, I've got more than 1 million miles on the 707. So that one's hard to ignore. And it really is. And more than 1,000 segments. But some of the more memorable ones, I was lucky enough to get a VC-10 ride twice on British Airways. That was pretty exciting. And the most exciting was I rode Concorde from London to Washington in 1977. That's never to be forgotten.
So is that really much louder on the inside than even a 707, Jon?
Oh, God, yes. Yeah, very loud. But of course, it's most of the noise you hear in an airplane at cruise is the air rushing across the fuselage, and when it's going by at twice the speed of sound, why it's quite a bit louder. And it was the airplane was confiding. It was like a DC-9 interior, I guess. But just to leave London at noon and get into Washington at 10:30 a.m. was pretty exciting with the time change.
I remember seeing the Concordes take off from Heathrow and from the Sheraton Skyline Hotel, and it was like watching military aircraft, right, with afterburner, just incredibly loud. It was an amazing sight to see.
I was at Kennedy one time. We were lined up to take off, and Concorde was ahead of us, and we're facing perpendicular to the runway. Concorde turned onto the runway, and the captain said something to the effect, for those of you on the right side of the airplane, you see Concorde taking off, and for those of you on the left, hear it. And then it's like, the thunder, all the kettle drums, and boom, boom, boom. But it was really exciting to ride it. Right on. I'm so glad I did.
Wow. Jack's asked another question here. Before we get to it, one type we didn't talk about is the Connie. Did you ever have a Connie flight, Jon?
One flight, and again, it goes back to the problem of
that's the one.
Starting in 1964, not having any passes for a year, and TWA eliminated the last Connie flight into LA in that summer of '64. So I did ride once from Indianapolis to Washington in 1966, I believe it was. That was the only one I got on. The 749A.
Okay. Now, Jack says, he says, Henry, thank you. I have all your books, and thanks to Henry, now your ebooks. They are all the gold standard in airliner books. Well, thank you very much, Jack. I mean, I've only done one book, so, but it's an honor for me to be able to present authors like Jon and their books in ebook format, so we can all continue to enjoy on our mobile devices. So I'm very grateful to be able to work with Jon.
Well, I think we may be able to let the cat out of the bag. That's a possibility of some more great Airliner series books coming up, too.
Now, does anybody else have any questions they want to send over to us? Okay, Mark asks, Henry and Jon, thank you. I really enjoyed the session. Great. Well, we're very happy to hear that. Thank you for joining us, Mark. Then Timothy Wichter.
Yeah, he says, we used to fly Viasa 880Ms from Venezuela, mostly to Miami. There were 7 Wicktors and 8 first-class seats. Like you mentioned, the cabin cruise was smooth and quiet, leading edge slats and flaps on the M model. might have helped domestic sales, but it didn't happen. I've learned a few 80 nuggets today, and thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to any new ebooks and images. Well, thank you very much, Timothy.
I think it was good. I think we all had a great, enjoyable time. We pretty much came in on our time budget. And I'd like to thank everybody for their attending, and very special thanks to you, Jon, for everything that you've done from a historical perspective over the past 30 and 40 years. And your work's going to be enjoyed for the next 100 years. That's our hope. So.
Well, it's rewarding to know that people are enjoying it, Henry. And again, there's more on my website, jonproctor.net, if you want to look at that stuff. And I'm going to continue to add to that as time goes on.
And until next time, we'll look forward to seeing you all here again. Thank you again, Jon. It's been a great pleasure.
And thanks to everybody that joined us.